When a desperate Montana rancher discovers his mail-order bride has been hiding a devastating secret that could destroy their marriage, he must choose between the deception that saved his ranch and the woman who transformed his heart. But what happens when her past arrives to claim her? And he realizes the real question isn't whether he can forgive her silence, but whether he's brave enough to fight for the love he never expected to find. Thunder crashed across the Montana sky like God himself was angry, and Jeremiah Stone knew exactly how he felt. The rain hammered against his cabin windows while he stared at the crumpled paper in his shaking hands. Another notice from the bank, painted red with urgent stamps and final warnings. 30 days, he whispered to the empty room. 30 days or they take everything. His cattle ranch stretched for miles beyond these walls. But what good was land when the bank owned your soul? 7 years had passed since Martha died of fever, leaving him alone with debts that grew like weeds after rain. Now, at 35, Jeremiah faced a choice that made his stomach twist. Lose everything his father built, or accept help from the one man he'd sworn never to trust again. The knock on his door came at the worst possible moment, right when he was considering whether his father's old rifle might solve more problems than it created. Through the rain-streaked glass, he spotted Reverend McAllister's fancy black carriage, its wheels already sinking into the mud like everything else good in this cursed valley. What does that snake want now? Jeremiah opened the door to find the Reverend standing there with his silver-tipped walking stick and that oil-slick smile that had fooled half the territory. Behind him, barely visible through the storm, sat a young woman in the carriage. Auburn hair pinned tight under a simple bonnet, green eyes that seemed to hold secrets deeper than the Missouri River. Jeremiah! McAllister's voice boomed over the thunder. Terrible weather for travel, but I bring news that couldn't wait. I'm not interested in buying salvation tonight, Reverend. Not selling it, my boy. I'm offering something much better. A solution to your financial troubles. The words hit Jeremiah like a punch to the gut. How did McAllister know about the bank notices? Then again, gossip traveled faster than wildfire in small territories, and bad news had wings. Come inside before you drown, Jeremiah muttered, stepping aside. But make it quick. The Reverend entered, shaking rain from his coat like a wet dog. I won't dance around the matter, Jeremiah. The whole territory knows about your debts. The bank's been quite vocal about their disappointment. Heat rose in Jeremiah's cheeks. Having your private shame discussed in public was worse than being poor. It was being poor and humiliated. What's your point? My point is sitting in that carriage. Her name is Catherine Brennan, fresh from Chicago, 22 years old, well-educated, and looking for a fresh start in the territories. Jeremiah glanced through the window at the mysterious woman. She sat perfectly still despite the storm raging around her, as if she lived in her own quiet world. Let me guess. She needs a husband, and you think I'm desperate enough to marry a stranger. Desperate? McAllister laughed. My dear boy, this is opportunity knocking. Miss Catherine comes with a dowry that would make kings jealous. Enough to pay off your debts and leave you with money to spare. The number McAllister whispered made Jeremiah's knees weak. It was more money than he'd seen in his entire life, enough to save the ranch and maybe even expand it. What's wrong with her? Jeremiah asked. No woman came with that kind of money unless something was seriously broken. Wrong? Nothing's wrong. She's simply quiet. Keeps to herself. Some men find that refreshing in a wife. Quiet. The word hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Martha had been the opposite. Always talking, laughing, filling their home with music and chatter. The silence that followed her death had nearly driven him mad. I want to meet her, Jeremiah said. Wonderful, but perhaps we should discuss this inside where it's warm. The poor girl is getting soaked. As they brought Catherine into the cabin, Jeremiah noticed how she moved, careful and watching, like a deer ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Her dress was simple but clean, her hands smooth but strong. When their eyes met, something flickered in her gaze, hope mixed with fear, like she'd been disappointed before. Miss Catherine, McAllister said loudly, as if she were hard of hearing. This is Mr. Jeremiah Stone, The rancher I told you about. She nodded politely but didn't speak. Her lips curved in what might have been a smile, but it never reached her eyes. Pleased to meet you, Jeremiah said. Catherine nodded again, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for permission to breathe. Something's definitely not right here. But when McAllister laid out the details, marriage within the week, dowry paid immediately, Catherine would handle housework while Jeremiah managed the ranch. Desperation made the impossible seem reasonable. I need time to think, Jeremiah said. Of course, but don't think too long. The bank waits for no man, and opportunities like this don't come twice. After they left, Jeremiah sat alone with his choices. Lose everything or marry a strange woman who might be his salvation or his ruin. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside his cabin, the silence felt deeper than ever. What secrets was that woman hiding behind those careful green eyes? 3 days of sleepless nights had left Jeremiah looking like death warmed over, but his decision was made. The bank notice on his kitchen table had grown more threatening with each sunrise, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Catherine returned with McAllister that afternoon, this time wearing a blue dress that brought out her eyes. She carried a small leather satchel. Apparently everything she owned in the world fit in one bag. Have you made your choice? McAllister asked, settling into Jeremiah's best chair without invitation. I have questions first. Natural. Ask away. Jeremiah turned to Catherine, studying her face for any sign of deception. Miss Catherine, why do you want to marry a stranger? She looked at McAllister, confusion flickering across her features. She's nervous, the Reverend explained quickly, not used to such direct conversation. Catherine, tell Mr. Stone about your desire for a new life in the territories. Catherine's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her hands moved in her lap, not fidgeting, but something else, like she was trying to speak with her fingers. I want. Her voice was barely a whisper, rusty from disuse. New beginning. The words came slowly, carefully, as if each one cost her something precious. What happened to your family in Chicago? Jeremiah pressed. Again that look to McAllister. Again that strange hand movement. Tragic story, the Reverend intervened. Parents died in a factory accident. Catherine's been living with relatives who, well, let's say they weren't kind to a young woman with no prospects. Catherine's face tightened at these words, and Jeremiah caught something in her expression. Not grief, but anger. Quick and bright before she hid it again. She doesn't like him speaking for her. Can you cook? Jeremiah asked her directly. A nod. Clean house. Another nod. Work with animals? This time she hesitated before nodding, uncertainty creeping in. She's a quick learner, McAllister added. Very adaptable. That word, adaptable, sounded wrong in the Reverend's mouth, like it meant something different than what most people would think. I need to speak with Miss Catherine alone, Jeremiah announced. McAllister's smile faltered. That's hardly proper. I'm not buying a horse, Reverend. If I'm going to marry this woman, I want 5 minutes without you translating her thoughts. For a moment, anger flashed in McAllister's eyes. Real anger that made Jeremiah's hand inch toward his gun belt. Then the oily smile returned. Of course, I'll wait outside. Check on the horses. After the door closed, Jeremiah and Catherine sat in awkward silence. She kept her eyes down, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Are you scared of me? He asked gently. She looked up, surprised by his tone. After a long moment, she shook her head. Of him. A pause. Then the smallest nod. Interesting. Why do you really want to leave Chicago? Catherine's eyes darted to the door, then back to his face. She opened her mouth, struggled with words, then closed it in frustration. Her hands moved again. Definitely some kind of gesturing, like she was trying to tell him something important. I don't understand, Jeremiah said. Tears gathered in her eyes. She stood abruptly, walked to his window, and stared out at the valley beyond. When she turned back, her face had set into determined lines. I Cook good, she said carefully. Work hard. No trouble. That's not what I asked. Please. The word came out broken. Please, Chance. Something in her voice, desperation deeper than his own, made Jeremiah's chest tight. Whatever had happened in Chicago, whatever deal McAllister had made, Catherine needed this marriage as much as he needed her dowry. If we do this, he said slowly, I'll expect honesty between us. No lies, no secrets. She nodded eagerly. And I'll treat you fair. I'm not a cruel man, just a lonely one. Thank you, she whispered. When McAllister returned, Jeremiah had made his choice. We'll marry this Sunday. Excellent. I'll make the arrangements. Catherine, aren't you pleased? She nodded, but Jeremiah noticed she was looking at him, not the Reverend. That night, alone again in his cabin, Jeremiah tried to convince himself he'd made the right decision. The money would save his ranch, and Catherine seemed decent enough, quiet, but not mean-spirited. Still, questions gnawed at him like hungry wolves. Why was she so afraid of McAllister? Why did her hands move like that when she couldn't find words? And why did he get the feeling that everyone in this arrangement was lying about something? What kind of bargain had he just made, and what price would he really pay for salvation? The wedding dress hung in Jeremiah's cabin like a ghost, and Catherine stared at it with the same expression a condemned prisoner might give a noose. Sunday morning had arrived gray and cold, matching the knot of dread twisted tight in her stomach. She'd barely slept, haunted by memories of Chicago, the cruel laughter of her aunt's friends, the whispered words that followed her everywhere, the way people's faces changed when they discovered her secret. Now she was about to trick another good man, and the guilt felt heavier than the Montana mountains pressing down on the valley. He'll hate me when he finds out, she thought, fingering the simple gold band McAllister had provided. But maybe I can be useful enough that he won't send me back. The Reverend had been clear about the consequences of disappointing her new husband. Chicago held nothing for her now except the asylum her aunt had threatened, a place where broken people disappeared forever. Catherine slipped into the cream-colored dress, her hands shaking as she fastened the tiny buttons. In the mirror, she looked like any other nervous bride, but inside she felt like a fraud. Jeremiah deserved better than a wife who couldn't even hear her own name spoken aloud. A knock at the door made her jump. Through the window, she saw Mrs. Patterson from town, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. The elderly woman's lips moved in what Catherine assumed were kind words, but all she could do was smile and nod, accepting the flowers with grateful hands. If only you knew what you were celebrating, Catherine thought bitterly. The church bells were ringing when they arrived. She could feel their vibrations through the wagon seat, a rumbling that seemed to shake her bones. The small wooden church of Copper Ridge looked peaceful in the morning light, but to Catherine it felt like walking into a trap. Inside, a handful of townspeople had gathered to witness the ceremony. Their faces were curious but not unkind, and Catherine felt a flicker of hope. Maybe frontier people were different from city folks. Maybe they wouldn't judge her so harshly. Then she saw Jeremiah waiting at the altar. He'd cleaned up nicely for the occasion, his dark hair combed back, his best suit brushed free of dust. But his eyes held the same uncertainty she'd seen during their awkward conversations. He was a good man making a desperate choice, and she was about to ruin his life. I should run, she thought, right now before it's too late. But where would she go? She had no money, no skills that city people valued, and winter was coming to the Montana territory. At least as Jeremiah's wife, she'd have a roof over her head and honest work to do. The ceremony began with McAllister's booming voice filling the small church. Catherine caught fragments of the traditional words by reading lips, but mostly she focused on Jeremiah's face. He looked as nervous as she felt, his hands fidgeting with his hat brim. When it came time for vows, she managed to whisper, "I do," at what seemed like the right moment, judging by the reactions around her. Jeremiah's voice was steady when he spoke, but she saw doubt flickering in his eyes. He knows something's wrong, she realized. He's not stupid. The ring slipped onto her finger, a simple band that felt impossibly heavy. When McAllister announced them husband and wife, Jeremiah leaned down to kiss her cheek. His lips were warm against her skin, but the gesture felt formal, like sealing a business deal rather than starting a marriage. As they walked back down the aisle, Catherine noticed the townspeople's faces more carefully. Mrs. Patterson looked pleased, but old Mr. Henderson wore a frown. Two women in the back row were whispering behind their hands, their expressions pitying. They know, Catherine realized with growing panic. Some of them know about me. Outside the church, people offered congratulations that Catherine couldn't hear but acknowledged with smiles and nods. A few seemed to expect conversation, and when she didn't respond appropriately, their smiles became strained. Shy little thing, isn't she? She read on one woman's lips. Poor Jeremiah. Another mouthed to her companion. He doesn't know what he's gotten himself into. The words hit Catherine like physical blows. She'd hoped for a fresh start, but her secret was already becoming common knowledge. How long before Jeremiah discovered the truth? The ride back to the ranch was awkward and silent. Jeremiah kept glancing at her, as if trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. Catherine stared at her hands, twisting the new ring around her finger. Are you feeling all right? Jeremiah asked as they approached his cabin. Catherine nodded quickly, not trusting her voice. You seem different today. Nervous, I guess. If only nervous was the worst of it. At the cabin, Jeremiah helped her down from the wagon with careful politeness. His touch was gentle but distant, like he was handling something fragile that might break. I know this is strange for both of us, he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. We don't know each other well, but I hope we can figure things out. Catherine nodded again, hating herself for the deception. He was being kind, trying to make her comfortable, and she was lying to him with every breath. I made up the spare room for you, he continued, until you're ready for other arrangements. Relief and disappointment warred in her chest. She'd expected him to claim his husbandly rights immediately, like her aunt had warned her men did. Instead, he was giving her space, treating her like a person rather than property. He really is a good man, she thought, which makes this so much worse. That evening, they sat at his small kitchen table sharing a simple meal she'd prepared. Catherine had learned to cook by watching and copying, and she was proud of her skills with bread and stew. At least she could contribute something useful to this sham of a marriage. Jeremiah ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting the food. Catherine smiled and nodded, but inside she was calculating how long she could maintain this pretense. Every conversation was a minefield, every interaction a chance to reveal her deception. Tell me about your family in Chicago, Jeremiah said, clearly trying to make conversation. Catherine's heart raced. She'd practiced this story with McAllister, but speaking it aloud felt like choking on lies. Not much to say, she managed. All gone now. I'm sorry. That must have been hard. She nodded, focusing on her plate to avoid his searching gaze. What did you do there? For work. I mean, survived, she thought. He'd tried to stay invisible. Helped with house things, she said carefully. You're good at it. This is the best meal I've had in years. His compliment warmed her despite everything. At least she could do this right. Keep house, cook meals, make his life more comfortable. Maybe that would be enough when he discovered her secret. But what happens when he wants children? When he expects a real wife instead of a housekeeper who shares his name? As night fell over the Montana Valley, Catherine lay in the narrow spare bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of her new home. She could feel vibrations through the walls when Jeremiah moved around, but the specific sounds remained a mystery. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expose herself as a fraud. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt almost safe. How long could a secret this big stay hidden in a place this small? Week 3 of married life arrived with the first real test, and it came in the form of Mrs. Patterson's unexpected visit while Jeremiah was checking the north pasture. Catherine was hanging laundry when she noticed the older woman approaching, her lips moving in what appeared to be friendly conversation. The problem was, Catherine had no idea what she was saying. Such lovely weather we're having, Mrs. Patterson seemed to be saying, though Catherine caught only fragments by reading her lips. Perfect for getting clothes dry. Catherine smiled and nodded, continuing to pin shirts to the line. This usually worked. Most people filled in their own conversations if you looked interested and responsive. But Mrs. Patterson stepped closer, her expression growing concerned. My dear, didn't you hear me ask about the church social next week? Church social? Catherine's mind raced. She hadn't heard about any social, which meant Jeremiah probably hadn't mentioned it, which meant she was supposed to have learned about it from somewhere else. Sorry, what? Catherine tried, buying time. The church social, Mrs. Patterson repeated, speaking more slowly. Reverend McAllister announced it last Sunday. Surely you remember. Catherine's blood turned to ice. She'd been in church, sitting right next to Jeremiah, but she'd missed the announcement completely. Of course she had. She'd been focused on reading lips and trying to figure out when to stand or sit. Oh yes, she lied. The social. Wonderful. We're all so excited to get to know you better. You've been so quiet since the wedding. Hardly said 2 words to anyone in town. Because I can't hear what anyone is saying to me. I'm shy, Catherine managed. Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Catherine's face with new intensity. Are you feeling all right, dear? You seem distracted. Before Catherine could answer, disaster struck in the form of pure clumsiness. As she reached for another wet shirt, her elbow knocked over the basket of clothespins. They scattered across the ground with what must have been a tremendous clatter, but Catherine continued hanging laundry, completely unaware of the noise. Mrs. Patterson's gasp was visible even if Catherine couldn't hear it. The older woman's face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, understanding, then something that looked like pity mixed with scandal. Oh my lord, Mrs. Patterson whispered, her hand covering her mouth. You can't hear me at all, can you? Catherine's hands froze on the wet fabric. The moment she'd been dreading had arrived, brought on by something as simple as falling clothespins. There was no point in lying now. Catherine turned to face Mrs. Patterson, her chin raised with as much dignity as she could muster. No, she said quietly. I can't. Mrs. Patterson's expression cycled through shock, sympathy, and then something darker. Does Jeremiah know? Catherine's silence was answer enough. Oh, you poor child, Mrs. Patterson said, but her tone carried judgment rather than genuine sympathy. That reverend, he didn't tell him, did he? Please, Catherine said, her voice breaking. Please don't. Don't what? Don't tell the truth? Jeremiah Stone is a good man who deserves to know what kind of arrangement he's gotten himself into. I work hard, Catherine said desperately. I take care of him. I don't cause trouble. That's not the point, dear. Marriage is supposed to be built on honesty. What you've done. It's not fair to him. Mrs. Patterson gathered her skirts with the air of a woman who just discovered a particularly juicy piece of gossip. I should go. But Catherine, this won't stay secret long. Small towns have a way of revealing the truth. After she left, Catherine sank onto the porch steps, her hands shaking. The laundry hung half-finished on the line, forgotten in the wake of her exposed secret. She'd known this day would come, but she'd hoped for more time to prove her worth. Maybe I can convince her to stay quiet, Catherine thought desperately. Maybe she'll understand if I explain, but even as she formed the plan, she knew it was hopeless. Mrs. Patterson had the look of a woman who just discovered gold. She wouldn't keep news this exciting to herself. An hour later, Jeremiah returned from the pasture, his face grim. Catherine knew immediately that he'd encountered Mrs. Patterson on the road. We need to talk, he said, his voice carefully controlled. They sat at the kitchen table where they'd shared so many awkward meals. But this time the air crackled with tension. Jeremiah's hands were folded in front of him, his knuckles white with strain. Mrs. Patterson had some interesting things to say, he began. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. Jeremiah, is it true? His voice was quiet, but she could see the anger building behind his eyes. Are you deaf? The word hung between them like a loaded gun. Catherine had heard it spoken about her countless times. sometimes with pity, sometimes with disgust, always with the assumption that it made her less than whole. "Yes," she whispered. Jeremiah's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, beginning to pace the small kitchen like a caged animal. "How long have you been planning to tell me?" he demanded. "Ever? Or were you just going to keep pretending forever?" "I wanted to tell you." "When?" "After we had children who might inherit your condition. After I'd made a complete fool of myself in front of the whole territory." His words cut deeper than any physical blow. Catherine had heard variations of this speech before, from her aunt, from doctors, from well-meaning neighbors who thought deafness was something shameful that needed to be hidden or cured. "It doesn't change anything," she said, desperation making her voice stronger. "I can still work. I can still take care of you." "Take care of me?" Jeremiah's laugh was bitter. "You can't even hear me when I call your name. What happens in an emergency? What happens when you don't hear danger coming?" "I manage fine. By lying to everyone around you. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? The whole town probably knows by now. They're probably laughing at the fool who married a defective woman without even knowing it." Defective. The word hit Catherine like a physical blow, confirming every fear she'd carried since childhood. She was broken, damaged goods, unworthy of love or respect. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." But Jeremiah was beyond listening. His face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, his eyes blazing with betrayal. "Sorry doesn't fix this," he snapped. "Sorry doesn't give me back my reputation or my trust. You've made me look like an idiot in front of the entire territory." He grabbed his hat from the peg by the door, his movements sharp with fury. "Where are you going?" Catherine asked. "To town. To hear what everyone's saying about the fool who married a deaf woman and didn't even know it." The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows, leaving Catherine alone with her shame and the ruins of her short-lived hope. What would happen to her now that the truth was out? Jeremiah Stone had never been a drinking man, but tonight he sat in Murphy's saloon with a bottle of whiskey that promised to drown his problems, or at least make them fuzzy enough to bear. The amber liquid burned his throat, but not as much as the shame burning in his chest. Well, came a familiar voice from behind him. "If it isn't the territory's most gullible bachelor." Jeremiah didn't need to turn around to recognize Jake Morrison's sneering tone. The man had been trying to buy Jeremiah's land for years, always with insults disguised as offers. "Not tonight, Morrison," Jeremiah growled into his glass. "Oh, but this is perfect timing." Morrison slid into the chair across from him, his smile sharp as a knife blade. "I hear congratulations are in order. Married yourself a real prize, didn't you?" The saloon had gone quieter, other patrons leaning in to catch the conversation. News traveled faster than wildfire in small towns, and Jeremiah's humiliation was apparently tonight's entertainment. "She can't hear a thunderclap if it happened right next to her ear," Morrison continued, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I suppose you figured that out by now, unless you're even more stupid than we thought." Jeremiah's hand tightened around his glass. "Shut your mouth. Makes a man wonder what other defects she might be hiding. Good thing you found out before you put a baby in her belly. Imagine if that curse passed on to your children." The glass shattered in Jeremiah's grip, whiskey and blood mixing on the wooden table. Morrison's laughter filled the sudden silence like poison. "Struck a nerve, did I?" Jeremiah lunged across the table, his fist connecting with Morrison's smug face in a satisfying crunch of cartilage. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of flying fists and curses, the other patrons scrambling out of the way. "She's worth 10 of you," Jeremiah roared, surprising himself with the words. Morrison landed a solid punch to Jeremiah's ribs, driving the air from his lungs. "Defending your broken wife now? How noble of you." They rolled across the saloon floor, knocking over chairs and spitting blood. Jeremiah fought with the desperate fury of a man whose pride had been shredded, but underneath the anger was something else. A fierce protectiveness he hadn't expected to feel. When had Catherine stopped being a burden and become someone worth defending? The fight ended when Murphy himself pulled them apart, both men breathing hard and sporting rapidly swelling bruises. "Take it outside if you want to kill each other," the barkeeper ordered. "I won't have my place torn apart over domestic troubles." Morrison spat blood and grinned through split lips. "This isn't over, Stone. Mark my words." After Morrison left, Jeremiah sat alone with his bleeding knuckles and scattered thoughts. The other patrons gave him a wide berth, their conversations returning to normal volume but their glances still following him. What kind of man was he? Angry at his wife for being deceived, but ready to fight anyone who insulted her? Jeremiah Stone? He looked up to find a young girl standing beside his table, maybe 10 years old, with bright eyes and confident bearing that seemed unusual for a child approaching a bloody, drunk stranger. "I'm Maggie Kowalski," she said. "My family just moved to the valley last month." "This isn't a place for children," Jeremiah muttered. "I know, but I saw you ride into town, and I wanted to talk to you about your wife." Something in her tone made him focus despite the whiskey fog. "What about her?" "She's not broken," Maggie said simply. "She's deaf. There's a difference." "What would you know about it?" "Because I can talk to her." Maggie held up her hands and moved her fingers in quick, graceful patterns. "Sign language. My mama taught me when I was little. We had a deaf neighbor back in Ohio." Jeremiah stared at the girl's dancing hands, remembering Catherine's strange finger movements during their awkward conversations. "You mean, she was trying to talk to me?" "Of course she was. But you couldn't understand her, so she had to pretend to be something she wasn't." Maggie's young face was serious beyond her years. "That must have been terribly lonely for her." Lonely. The word hit Jeremiah like cold water, sobering him up. He'd been so focused on his own humiliation that he hadn't considered Catherine's side of the story. What must it have been like for her? Trapped in silence while everyone around her spoke in voices she couldn't hear. "She needs someone to understand her," Maggie continued. "Someone willing to learn her language instead of expecting her to be something she's not." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I saw her in the general store yesterday, and she looked sadder than anyone should look. And because my mama says good marriages are built on understanding, not on both people being exactly the same." The girl left as quickly as she'd appeared, leaving Jeremiah alone with thoughts that refused to stay quiet. He'd married Catherine out of desperation, expecting her to fill the hole Martha's death had left in his life. But Catherine wasn't Martha. She was someone entirely different, with her own struggles and strengths. Had he given her a chance to show him who she really was? Or had he been too busy nursing his wounded pride to see the woman behind the deception? The ride home through the darkness gave him time to think, and what he thought about surprised him. Catherine's careful attention to his needs, the way she watched his face when he spoke, the gentle touch of her hands when she served his meals. She'd been trying to communicate in the only ways she could, and he'd been too blind to see it. The cabin was dark when he arrived, but a faint glow came from the kitchen window. Inside, he found Catherine sitting at the table with a half-finished letter in front of her, tears staining the paper. She looked up when he entered, her eyes taking in his bruised face and bloody knuckles. Without a word, she rose and fetched water and clean cloth, beginning to tend his wounds with gentle efficiency. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. She paused, meeting his eyes for the first time since their confrontation. In her gaze he saw pain, fear, and something that might have been hope. "I know," she whispered, "but I want to." As she cleaned the blood from his hands, Jeremiah noticed the letter she'd been writing. The handwriting was careful and clear, each word precisely formed. "Dear Aunt Margaret," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to tell you that my marriage has failed, as you predicted it would. I will be returning to Chicago as soon as I can arrange transportation. Please let me know if you still have connections at the asylum, as I fear that will be my only option now. You're leaving." The words came out harsher than he intended. Catherine's hands stilled on the bandage she was wrapping around his knuckles. "You don't want me here." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." Her voice was barely audible. "I understand. I'm not what you expected. I'm not what any man would want. But was that true? Or was it just what she'd been told so many times that she believed it? Looking at her bent head, at the careful way she tended his wounds despite his earlier cruelty, Jeremiah felt something shift inside his chest. Catherine wasn't broken. She was brave. Brave enough to marry a stranger. Brave enough to try building a life in the wilderness. Brave enough to care for a man who'd called her defective. What kind of strength did it take to keep hoping when the world kept telling you that you weren't enough? Morning came too soon, bringing with it the sound Jeremiah had learned to dread. Catherine moving quietly through the house, packing her few belongings for a journey that would take her away forever. He lay in bed listening to her careful footsteps, wrestling with feelings he couldn't quite name. Was he really going to let her go? Let her disappear back to whatever hell she'd escaped from in Chicago? By the time he dressed and entered the kitchen, Catherine had breakfast ready. Perfectly cooked eggs, fresh bread, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Her traveling bag sat by the door like an accusation. The morning stage comes through at 10, she said without looking at him. I've left instructions for the housework. The bread recipe is written down, and there's enough preserved food to last through next month. She spoke like a housekeeper giving notice, not a wife saying goodbye to her husband. The careful distance in her voice made something ache in Jeremiah's chest. Catherine, please don't. She finally met his eyes, and he saw tears she was fighting to hold back. This is hard enough already. A knock at the door interrupted whatever he might have said. Through the window, Jeremiah saw young Maggie Kowalski standing on his porch, her parents behind her looking uncertain but determined. Mr. Stone, Anna Kowalski called. We were hoping to speak with you and your wife. Catherine looked confused as Jeremiah opened the door. The Kowalskis entered, Maggie immediately going to Catherine and beginning to move her hands in those graceful gestures Jeremiah now knew were sign language. Catherine's face transformed with wonder and relief. Her own hands began to move tentatively at first, then with growing excitement. For the first time since he'd known her, she was having a real conversation. What are they saying? Jeremiah asked. Maggie is telling her that she doesn't have to be ashamed, Anna translated. That being deaf doesn't make her broken or worthless. The same thing I should have told her, Jeremiah realized with a stab of guilt. The conversation continued in flowing hand movements, Catherine's face growing more animated with each exchange. She was laughing, actually laughing, as Maggie told what must have been a funny story. She says she hasn't talked to anyone in her own language for 3 years. Anna continued translating. She's been so lonely. 3 years. Jeremiah tried to imagine 3 years of complete isolation, of being surrounded by people but unable to truly communicate with any of them. Mrs. Stone, Anna said, speaking directly to Catherine while signing. Maggie told us you were planning to leave. We came to ask you to reconsider. Catherine's hands moved in response, her expression sad but determined. She says her husband doesn't want a defective wife, Anna translated, her voice sharp with disapproval. She thinks it's better if she goes back to Chicago. Back to what? Jeremiah asked, surprising himself by speaking up. Catherine's hands paused in their movement. What's waiting for you in Chicago? He pressed. Family who care about you? A job? A home? Through Anna's translation, Catherine's story emerged in painful pieces. The aunt who'd seen her as a burden, the relatives who'd whispered about her being cursed, the threats of the asylum when she became too expensive to keep. She'd been sold to Reverend McAllister like livestock, with promises of a kind husband who needed a housekeeper. She thought you knew, Anna said softly. She thought you chose her anyway, which made her hope that maybe someone could see past her deafness to the person underneath. And instead, I called her defective and made her feel like a fraud. I was wrong, Jeremiah said, looking directly at Catherine even though she couldn't hear his words. Tell her I was wrong. As Anna translated, Catherine's eyes filled with tears. Her hands moved in what looked like a question. She wants to know what you were wrong about, Anna said. Jeremiah took a deep breath, gathering courage he didn't know he possessed. Tell her that I was wrong to think deafness made her less of a person. Wrong to be more worried about what other people thought than about her feelings. Wrong to call her defective when she's the strongest person I've ever met. Catherine's hands fluttered as Anna translated, her face cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that might have been forgiveness. She says she understands why you were angry, Anna continued. She says she would have been angry too if someone had tricked her. But I don't want her to go, Jeremiah said, the words coming from somewhere deep in his chest. Tell her I want to learn. Her language, I want to learn how to talk to her properly. The conversation in sign language that followed was rapid and emotional, Catherine's face showing a dozen different feelings. Finally, she turned to Jeremiah with tears streaming down her cheeks. Through Anna's translation, her words came haltingly. She says she's afraid to hope. She's been disappointed too many times. But if you really mean it, if you really want to try, she'll stay. I mean it, Jeremiah said firmly. But Catherine, I need you to promise me something too. She waited, her hands poised to respond. No more pretending. No more trying to be someone you're not. If we're going to make this work, it has to be built on truth. Catherine's nod was barely perceptible, but her hands moved in what Anna translated as, I promise. No more lies between us. As the Kowalskis prepared to leave, Maggie hugged Catherine tightly and signed something that made the older woman smile through her tears. What did she say? Jeremiah asked. She told Catherine that love isn't about hearing someone's voice, Anna explained. It's about understanding their heart. And some of the most important conversations happen without words. After they left, Jeremiah and Catherine stood in their kitchen, facing each other across a gulf that suddenly seemed crossable. Her traveling bag still sat by the door, but it no longer looked like an ending. It looked like a choice, one she'd decided not to make. So, Jeremiah said, then stopped, realizing she couldn't hear him. Instead, he pointed to himself, then to her, then made a gesture he hoped meant, together. Catherine's smile was radiant as she nodded and repeated his gesture, adding movements that clearly meant yes and together, and something else that looked like home. Maybe they didn't need perfect communication to build something real. Maybe they just needed the willingness to try. 2 months after Catherine unpacked her traveling bag, Jeremiah discovered something that made his blood run cold. 3 riders approaching his ranch at sunset, and he recognized the expensive horse in the lead. Reverend McAllister had returned, and he hadn't come alone. Catherine, Jeremiah called, but of course she couldn't hear him. He ran to the house, finding her in the kitchen preparing dinner. When she saw his face, her hands immediately asked what was wrong. Jeremiah's sign language was still clumsy, but he'd learned enough to communicate basic ideas. Bad men coming. Hide. Catherine peered through the window, her face going pale when she spotted McAllister. Her hands moved frantically. Uncle Julius. He found me. Uncle? Jeremiah had never heard about any uncle. Through rapid gestures and drawn pictures, Catherine explained. Her mother's brother from Chicago, the one who'd arranged her marriage deal with McAllister. A man she'd hoped never to see again. The riders dismounted with purpose, their expensive clothes and city manners out of place in the Montana wilderness. Beside McAllister rode a tall, thin man with cold eyes and a shorter, stockier fellow carrying a leather medical bag. Jeremiah! McAllister's voice boomed across the yard. Come greet your guests. Jeremiah stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between the men and his front door. Reverend, wasn't expecting you back. Life is full of surprises, McAllister replied with his oily smile. I'd like you to meet Mr. Julius Brennan, Catherine's uncle and legal guardian, and Dr. Edmund Cartwright from the Territorial Hospital. Brennan stepped forward, removing his hat with false politeness. Mr. Stone, I've come a long way to discuss my niece's situation. What situation? Jeremiah kept his voice steady despite the ice forming in his veins. The unfortunate deception that led to your marriage, Dr. Cartwright interjected. We understand you were not informed about Catherine's affliction before the ceremony. Affliction. The word hit Jeremiah like a slap. 2 months ago, he might have agreed with them. Now, after watching Catherine nurse a sick calf back to health using only her eyes and gentle touch, after learning to communicate through gestures that said more than most people's words, he understood that these men saw her as something she wasn't. "My wife isn't afflicted," Jeremiah said firmly. "She's deaf." Brennan's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "Come now, Mr. Stone. Let's not pretend this arrangement has been anything but difficult for you. A man needs a wife who can hear his words, respond to his calls, bear children without passing on her defects. Children. The thought of children with Catherine had begun to feel less like a burden and more like a possibility. Would they be deaf? Maybe. Would that make them less worthy of love? Absolutely not. "Catherine is my wife," Jeremiah said simply. "She stays here." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Dr. Cartwright said, opening his medical bag and retrieving official-looking papers. "You see, Catherine was never legally competent to consent to marriage. The ceremony is invalid." McAllister stepped forward with practiced smoothness. "We've come to correct this unfortunate mistake. Catherine will receive proper care at a facility designed for people with her limitations. You'll be compensated for your troubles, of course." Proper care. Jeremiah had heard whispers about such places, warehouses for the inconvenient, where different meant dangerous and silence was enforced through more than just physical limitations. "She's not going anywhere," Jeremiah said. "Oh, but she is," Brennan replied, his false politeness slipping away. "Catherine has always been my responsibility. When her parents died, she became my ward. I tried to be kind, allowing her to live with family, but she's proven too much of a burden." Behind him, Jeremiah sensed rather than heard Catherine approaching. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. When she saw her uncle, her hands moved in sharp, angry gestures. "What's she doing?" Dr. Cartwright asked with clinical interest. "Talking," Jeremiah replied, though he couldn't understand everything Catherine was signing. Her movements were too fast, too emotional for his limited vocabulary. "Nonsense," Brennan scoffed. "She's having one of her fits. Catherine has always been prone to episodes when she's upset." "Episodes?" Jeremiah looked at Catherine, seeing not madness but fury, righteous anger at being discussed like property instead of a person. "Dr. Cartwright has brought medication to help calm her for the journey," McAllister explained. "The Illinois Institution for the Deaf and Dumb has excellent facilities for managing difficult cases." Managing difficult cases. The words made Jeremiah's stomach turn. They were talking about his wife like she was a dangerous animal that needed to be caged. "She's not difficult," Jeremiah said through gritted teeth. "She's intelligent and capable. She runs this household better than most hearing women could." "Sentiment is admirable," Dr. Cartwright replied condescendingly, "but hardly practical. People like Catherine require constant supervision. They can't function in normal society." Normal society. Jeremiah thought about the past 2 months. Catherine teaching him to read her expressions, showing him how she used vibrations to sense approaching horses, communicating complex ideas through drawings and gestures. She functioned just fine. It was society that had the problem. "You're not taking her," he said firmly. Brennan's mask of politeness finally fell away completely. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice. I have legal guardianship, and Dr. Cartwright has medical authority. Catherine comes with us, willing or not." The 3 men moved toward the porch with the confidence of people who'd never been told no. Behind Jeremiah, Catherine's breathing quickened, her hands clutching his arm with desperate strength. She was terrified. "Over my dead body," Jeremiah said, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. Now, McAllister chuckled. "No need for dramatics. This is a simple family matter. Catherine belongs with people who understand her condition." "I understand her condition," Jeremiah shot back. "She's deaf, not insane. She can think, feel, and make her own choices." "Can she?" Dr. Cartwright pulled out a syringe from his bag. "Because according to her medical history, Catherine has a pattern of violent outbursts and hysteria. She needs professional treatment." "Violent outbursts?" Jeremiah had never seen Catherine raise her voice, let alone become violent. The only hysteria he'd witnessed was her fear of these very men. "That's a lie," he said. "Is it?" Brennan's smile was cruel. "Ask her about the fire in Chicago. Ask her about the family she nearly killed with her carelessness." Catherine's face went white as chalk, her hands shaking as she began to sign frantically. Jeremiah caught fragments. "Accident, not my fault, they blamed me." But the full story remained locked behind his limited understanding of her language. What had happened in Chicago? And more importantly, what were these men planning to do with his wife? The standoff stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Catherine stood behind Jeremiah, her whole body trembling with memories he couldn't understand, while the three men faced them with the casual confidence of predators cornering prey. "Tell your husband about the fire, Catherine," Brennan called out, his voice carrying false sympathy. "Tell him how your limitations nearly cost innocent lives." Catherine's hands moved desperately, trying to explain something complex and painful. Jeremiah caught signs for candle. Couldn't hear, warning, and accident, but the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. "She set fire to her aunt's boarding house," Dr. Cartwright explained with clinical detachment. "Left a candle burning in her room because she couldn't hear the other tenants shouting warnings about the wind. 3 families lost everything they owned. That's why they want her gone," Jeremiah realized. "Not because she's deaf, but because they blame her for something that was an accident." "Accidents happen," he said firmly. "That doesn't make her dangerous, doesn't it?" Brennan stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. "What happens when she can't hear a child crying? When she misses the sound of danger approaching? How many people have to suffer because of her defect?" The word defect hung in the air like poison. Jeremiah felt Catherine flinch behind him, and something hot and protective flared in his chest. "The only defect I see here," he said quietly, "is in people who can't see past their own fear and ignorance." McAllister's patience finally snapped. "Enough of this foolishness. Catherine, come along. We have a long journey ahead of us." When Catherine didn't move, Dr. Cartwright stepped forward with his syringe. "Perhaps some medication to help with travel anxiety." "Touch her and die," Jeremiah said, his gun clearing leather with practiced speed. The doctor froze, suddenly realizing they weren't dealing with the desperate, grateful man they'd expected to find. The Jeremiah Stone standing before them was protective, determined, and very obviously willing to fight for his wife. "Put the gun down, son," McAllister said with strained calm. "This doesn't have to get unpleasant." "It got unpleasant the moment you showed up at my door with lies and drugs," Jeremiah replied. "Catherine stays here." Behind him, he felt rather than heard Catherine moving. She appeared at his side, her chin raised with dignity despite her obvious fear. Her hands moved in careful, deliberate signs that even Jeremiah's limited vocabulary could understand. "I stay. My choice. You see." Brennan laughed harshly. "She doesn't even understand what's at stake. The Illinois institution has dealt with hundreds of cases like hers. She'll be much happier with her own kind. Her own kind. As if deafness was a different species instead of simply a different way of experiencing the world." "What gives you the right?" Jeremiah demanded. "What gives any of you the right to decide what's best for another person?" "The law," Dr. Cartwright replied smugly. "Guardianship laws exist to protect people who can't protect themselves." "She doesn't need protection from life," Jeremiah shot back. "She needs protection from people like you." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the confrontation. Through the gathering dusk, Jeremiah spotted riders, several of them, moving with purpose toward his ranch. Reinforcements. His heart sank as he realized the 3 men might have brought backup. But as the riders drew closer, Jeremiah recognized the lead horse and felt hope flare in his chest. Anna Kowalski rode in front, her husband beside her, young Maggie behind them. Following were other neighbors, the Hendersons, the Murphy family, even old Doc Peterson from town. "Looks like you've got visitors, Jeremiah," Anna called out as they dismounted. Her eyes took in the scene quickly, noting the drawn gun and the terrified look on Catherine's face. Mrs. Kowalski, McAllister began with forced charm, this is a private family matter. Nothing that affects Catherine is private in this valley, Anna interrupted firmly. She's one of us now. Maggie ran directly to Catherine, her hands flying in rapid sign language. Catherine's response was equally quick, and whatever she communicated made Maggie's young face harden with anger. She says these men want to take her away, Maggie announced to the assembled neighbors. They want to lock her up because she's deaf. A murmur of outrage rippled through the group. These were frontier people who'd learned to value practical skills over social conventions, and they'd all benefited from Catherine's help over the past 2 months. Catherine helped birth my grandson when Doc Peterson couldn't get through the storm, Mrs. Henderson declared. She knew exactly what to do without hearing a word of instruction. She spotted disease in my cattle before I saw any symptoms, added James Murphy. Saved my whole herd because she notices things the rest of us miss. The woman makes the best bread in 3 counties, Doc Peterson contributed. And she's got a gentle touch with sick folks that can't be taught. One by one, the neighbors shared stories of Catherine's contributions to their community. She'd helped with difficult births, tended sick children, assisted in emergencies, and solved problems through observation and intuition that put hearing folks to shame. Intelligence isn't measured by the noise you make, Anna declared firmly, echoing words she'd spoken months earlier. It's measured by the good you do. Dr. Cartwright looked increasingly uncomfortable as the testimonies continued. This wasn't the isolated, helpless woman his papers described. This was someone who'd woven herself into the fabric of the community through competence and kindness. All very touching, Brennan said dismissively. But the law is the law. Catherine is my ward, and she's coming with us. Actually, Doc Peterson stepped forward, pulling papers from his coat. I took the liberty of researching territorial law after Mrs. Kowalski told me about your visit. Guardianship can be challenged when the ward demonstrates competency and expresses clear preferences about their care. And marriage grants certain legal protections, Anna added, producing her own set of documents, especially when the community can testify to the person's mental fitness and social integration. Brennan's confidence wavered as he realized these frontier people had come prepared for legal battle, not just emotional appeals. This is ridiculous, McAllister sputtered. You can't just. Actually, we can, Doc Peterson interrupted. I've taken the liberty of contacting the territorial judge. He'll be here tomorrow to review the case and hear testimony from community members about Catherine's competency and her marriage's validity. The 3 men exchanged uncertain glances, their easy victory suddenly looking like a complicated legal battle in hostile territory. But would a judge's decision be enough to protect Catherine? Or were these men prepared to take her by force rather than accept defeat? As darkness fell over the Montana Valley, battle lines were drawn around a woman whose only crime was experiencing the world differently than others expected. The real fight was just beginning. Dawn brought the territorial judge and a crowd that transformed Jeremiah's ranch into an impromptu courthouse. But the real shock came when Catherine walked outside carrying a carefully written letter that would change everything. Judge Harrison sat behind a makeshift table on the porch, his weathered face serious as he reviewed the legal documents both sides had presented. This is highly irregular, he announced to the assembled crowd. But given the circumstances and the remote location, I'll hear testimony here rather than delay justice by requiring travel to the county seat. Catherine approached the judge with steady steps, her letter clutched in trembling hands. Through Maggie's translation, she requested permission to speak for herself, something that clearly surprised everyone, including Jeremiah. What was in that letter? And when had she learned to write so well in English? Mrs. Stone, the judge said formally, you understand that this hearing will determine your legal status and future care? Catherine nodded, then handed him the letter. Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose as he read, his expression shifting from skeptical to impressed. Gentlemen, he said, addressing Brennan and his companions, Mrs. Stone has written a detailed account of the events in Chicago. Her version differs significantly from the story you've presented. Dr. Cartwright scoffed. Written testimony from a mentally deficient person hardly constitutes reliable evidence. This letter demonstrates clear reasoning, proper grammar, and complex emotional understanding, the judge replied sharply. Hardly the work of someone mentally deficient. Through Maggie's translation, Catherine began to tell her story. The fire in Chicago hadn't been caused by her carelessness with a candle. It had started when her hearing aunt forgot a pot of grease on the stove while arguing with a neighbor. Catherine had been the first to notice the smoke, had run through the boarding house warning everyone she could find through gestures and touch. She saved lives that night, Maggie translated as Catherine's hands moved urgently. But afterward, her aunt blamed her because it was easier than admitting her own mistake. Said Catherine should have heard the grease popping, should have prevented the accident. So she'd been blamed for not hearing something that prevented a disaster she actually helped solve. That's a convenient story, Brennan sneered, but hardly verifiable. Who's going to believe the word of a deaf woman over established members of Chicago society? His question was answered by an unexpected voice from the back of the crowd. I will. Everyone turned to see a middle-aged woman stepping forward, her travel-stained dress and determined expression marking her as someone who journeyed far to be here. Mrs. Elena Martinez, she introduced herself to the judge. I owned the boarding house next door to the fire. I saw everything that happened that night. Brennan's face went pale. Elena, what are you doing here? Following my conscience, she replied firmly. After I heard about your plans for Catherine, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Her testimony painted a picture completely different from Brennan's accusations. Catherine had indeed been the hero of that terrible night, risking her own safety to wake sleeping families, using her ability to feel vibrations through walls to locate people trapped by smoke. The real tragedy, Mrs. Martinez continued, was watching that girl be blamed for something she prevented from being much worse. Her aunt needed a scapegoat, and Catherine's deafness made her an easy target. Dr. Cartwright tried to discredit the testimony, pulling out medical files that supposedly documented Catherine's episodes of hysteria and violent behavior. But Mrs. Martinez wasn't finished. Those medical records are falsified, she declared. I was present when Dr. Lawson examined Catherine after the fire. She showed no signs of mental instability, only exhaustion and smoke inhalation. That's a serious accusation, Judge Harrison said gravely. It's a serious crime, Mrs. Martinez replied. Dr. Cartwright and Julius Brennan have been using fraudulent medical records to commit people to institutions, then claiming their property and assets. Catherine isn't their first victim. A conspiracy. The pieces suddenly clicked into place for Jeremiah. This wasn't about Catherine's welfare. It was about money and power, using society's prejudice against deaf people as cover for theft and imprisonment. The crowd's mood shifted dramatically as Mrs. Martinez revealed the extent of the scheme. Other families had lost members to similar medical interventions, all orchestrated by men who profited from convincing courts that deafness equaled incompetence. Where's your proof? Brennan demanded, but his bluster couldn't hide the panic in his voice. Mrs. Martinez pulled out a thick folder of documents. Bank records, correspondence, testimonies from other victims' families. I've been investigating this for months, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. Judge Harrison examined the papers with growing anger. The evidence was overwhelming, a pattern of fraud, false imprisonment, and theft disguised as medical care. Mr. Brennan, Dr. Cartwright, the judge said coldly, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and false imprisonment. Reverend McAllister, your role in this scheme will be investigated thoroughly. As the three men were led away in shackles, Catherine stood surrounded by neighbors who now saw her not as a burden or curiosity, but as a survivor of injustice who'd found the courage to fight back. But was the danger really over? Or were there other forces at work that nobody had seen coming? Through Maggie's translation, Catherine asked the question that had been haunting her. What happens to the other people they locked away? The ones who are still trapped in those places. Judge Harrison's expression grew grim. We'll investigate every case, free every person wrongfully committed. But that will take time, and some may be too damaged by their treatment to return to normal life. The weight of those words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Catherine's story had a happy ending, but how many others were still living in the nightmare she'd escaped? As the legal proceedings concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Jeremiah found himself standing with his wife in the quiet aftermath of their victory. Catherine's letter had not only freed her from the threat of the asylum, it had exposed a criminal conspiracy and potentially saved dozens of other innocent people. Who was this woman he'd married? Not the helpless burden he'd been told to expect, but someone with the intelligence to document injustice and the courage to speak truth to power. Looking into Catherine's eyes, Jeremiah realized his journey of understanding had only just begun. What other strengths had she been hiding? And what would their future look like now that she was truly free to be herself? 5 years later, the sound that woke Jeremiah wasn't sound at all. It was Catherine's gentle touch on his shoulder, her way of letting him know their 3-year-old daughter Hope was calling for attention. The morning sun streamed through windows of a house that had grown from a simple cabin into a proper home, filled with the warmth of a family that communicated in ways he'd never imagined possible. "Mama! Papa!" Hope's voice mixed with rapid hand movements as she stood in her crib, switching effortlessly between spoken words and sign language. At 3, she was already bilingual in ways that amazed the neighbors, proving that communication came in many forms, all equally valuable. Catherine's face glowed with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd found her place in the world. The fear that had haunted her eyes during those early months had been replaced by confident peace, though Jeremiah still caught her sometimes staring at the horizon as if she couldn't quite believe her good fortune was real. "The Patterson boy is coming today for his lesson," Catherine signed to Jeremiah, her movements fluid and graceful. Over the years, she'd become the Valley's unofficial teacher of sign language, helping other families communicate with deaf children and showing hearing folks that silence didn't mean emptiness. Mrs. Patterson, the same woman who'd exposed Catherine's secret years ago, now brought her grandson twice a week to learn from the woman she'd once pitied. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first months after the trial had been filled with awkward encounters and curious stares as the community adjusted to seeing Catherine as a person rather than a problem. But gradually, her quiet competence and generous spirit had won over even the most skeptical neighbors. "The cattle in the north pasture are acting strange," Jeremiah signed back, his movements much more confident now. "Can you check on them while I repair the fence?" Catherine nodded, then paused, her hands moving in a question that made Jeremiah's heart skip. "Do you think they're sick? Or is something else bothering them?" "Something else." Catherine's ability to read animal behavior through visual cues had saved their herd multiple times over the years. She could spot illness, predators, and weather changes before anyone else, turning what others saw as a disability into a valuable skill. The ranch had prospered under their joint management. Catherine's preserved foods had become legendary at county fairs. Her gardens produced vegetables that neighbors traded favors to obtain, and her intuitive understanding of livestock had helped them build one of the most successful operations in the territory. But their success wasn't just financial. Letters arrived regularly from other parts of the country, families who'd heard about Catherine's story and wanted advice about their own deaf relatives. The house had become an unofficial stop on what people were starting to call the Understanding Railroad, a network of families helping each other navigate the challenges of communication differences. Who would have imagined that the woman he'd been tricked into marrying would become a beacon of hope for others facing similar struggles? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, Jeremiah saw a familiar figure, Mrs. Martinez, who'd stayed in the valley after the trial and become Catherine's closest friend and business partner in their informal counseling work. "Elena's here for the planning meeting," Catherine signed. "About the school." The school. Their latest project was ambitious, establishing the territory's first school designed to educate both deaf and hearing children together. Catherine had written letters to educators back east, corresponded with other pioneers in deaf education, and slowly built support for the revolutionary idea that deaf children deserved the same educational opportunities as their hearing peers. Governor's response came yesterday, Elena announced as she entered, waving an official-looking letter. "He's approved funding for the pilot program." Catherine's face lit up with joy as Elena shared the news through a mixture of speech and sign language. After years of planning and lobbying, their school would become reality. the Montana Territory School for All Children, the first of its kind west of the Mississippi. Hope toddled over to Elena, chattering in her mixture of words and signs. Abuela Elena, will you tell me the story about Mama and the bad men? Abuela, grandmother in Spanish. Elena had no children of her own, but she'd adopted Catherine and Hope as family, creating bonds deeper than blood. Maybe when you're older, little one, Elena replied. That's a story about very brave people who fought for what was right. As the women discussed school plans, Jeremiah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd married Catherine out of desperation, expecting her to be a burden he'd have to bear. Instead, she'd become his partner in building something larger than either of them could have accomplished alone. Their ranch was successful, but their real achievement was the community they'd helped create, a place where differences were seen as strengths rather than weaknesses. The first students arrive next month, Catherine signed to him. Are you ready to have 12 children underfoot every day? Jeremiah grinned, remembering the lonely man who'd stood on this same porch 5 years ago, facing bankruptcy and despair. That man couldn't have imagined the richness that would come from opening his heart to someone the world had labeled as defective. I'm ready, he signed back. Are you? Catherine's smile was radiant as she nodded, then moved her hands in a gesture he'd learned meant much more than simple agreement. It meant partnership, shared purpose, and the kind of love that grew stronger through understanding rather than despite differences. As the morning sun climbed higher over their thriving valley, Hope played at their feet while Elena and Catherine planned lessons that would teach children that communication came in many forms, all equally valid, all equally valuable. The light Catherine had brought to the valley wasn't the harsh glare of conformity or the cold illumination of pity. It was the warm, steady glow of acceptance, the recognition that human worth wasn't measured by how closely someone matched others' expectations, but by their capacity to love and contribute in their own unique way. Standing on his porch, surrounded by the family he'd never expected to have, Jeremiah understood that some of life's greatest gifts come disguised as challenges. The woman who'd been presented to him as damaged goods had instead proven to be exactly what he needed, not to fill the hole Martha's death had left, but to help him build something entirely new. True communication, he'd learned, began with the courage to listen with more than your ears.